In this video, we're going to carry on with the FS module doing something similar to the previous video, but this time you're going to go for the asynchronous way. So this means that you're going to be using callback functions in your FS operations. So JavaScript code in this case is going to be unblocking. So this means that JavaScript can move to the next line while an FS operation is waiting for a certain callback to be executed. So following is the structure of our lecture. So first of all, we're going to look at how to check if a file exists using the asynchronous way. So there are a couple of ways we can do this, and I'm going to explain the difference between those two. And then after that, you're going to play with the read, write, and append operations using the asynchronous way. So let's start with checking if a certain file exists. So let's check if mass.txt exists. So I'm going to copy some code from the previous file. Where we required the FS module. And then defined variables where we stored the names of our files. So first, let's check if mass exists. So to do this, you can use the method start. So this method is to be used if you are planning to manipulate the file afterwards. So basically, if you are planning to read the file or write into the file and you just want to make sure that it does exist, then you can use this method. By the way, there is another method called exists, which is deprecated, so you can use this one instead. So this method will take the name of your file or the path of the file, and it will take a function which is going to be a callback. So let's give it let's call the parameter error for error, and basically what we're going to do, we'll check if the error exists, and if that's the case, we'll just log the error. Okay, so let's try this. Okay, so we're not getting any error. This means that the file exists. So you can just write else console.log mass exists. So let's try again. Here we go, mass.txt exists. Okay, so the next method is to be used to, well, check user permissions, and also you can use it if you are not planning to manipulate the file later on. So for example, if you are trying to read a file, then it's not recommended to use the method which is called fs.access, but instead you use straight away the read method, which we will cover in a bit, and you just manipulate errors using the callback. Okay, so access is usually used to check the user permissions of the file, and we'll see in a bit how to do that. So this method will take the path of the file as well, and a callback. So for example, we can just console.log something like error, and then error. So let's save and try this. Okay, so error here gives us null because there is no error. So instead of writing it like this, you can check if the error exists, like that, and then log it if that's the case. Okay. Now if you try a file that does not exist, then you will get an error. So errors here, they have an error code. So in this example, the error code is ennuent, which refers to a file that does not exist. If you want to look up the list of error codes, you can go to the node documentation and then look for errors. And here at the bottom, if you type error.code, you'll find this link. If you click on it, then it will give you the different error codes that you may encounter. So if you search common system errors, you'll find a common list of system errors, and one of them is ennuent, and this refers to no such file or directory. Okay, so the common ones are right there. So for example, if you get an error saying enot empty, then it means that the directory is not empty. Okay, so that's something you get if you're trying an operation that requires an empty directory, for example. Okay, so let's go back to our file and let's go back to Mars, like that. All right, so this function access normally takes a second parameter, which is a constant. So by default, this constant is set to fs.constant.f_OK. So this is the default constants that you would use to check if a file exists. Now to check the list of these constants, you can just type fs.constants in Google. Let's go to the documentation page. And if you click there, you'll find the file access constants. So these are the constants that you would use with the access method of fs. So the syntax is fs.constants dot the constant you want. So this is the default one, which tells us that the file exists. Now, if you want to check if a file is readable, then it's r_OK. If it's writable, it's w instead of r. And if it's executable, then it's x. And this means that it can be executed by the calling process. Okay, so now let's try with f_OK and see what we get. So, or instead r_OK, sorry. So we're not getting any error because our file is readable. If you try with w, again, it should work because the file is writable. Now, what if we change the permissions of the file before trying that? So let's say that we want to change the permissions of mars.text to 444, for example, meaning that the file can be read, but you can't write into it. So you need to add a 0 at the front which says that we're using an auxon number. So the syntax is fs.change mode, and our file is Mars, and we need to add our permissions and a callback. So let's use the same callback we've got there. So let's try this. Okay, so we're getting an error here, and it says e-access, meaning permission denied. So basically, we can't write into this file because we set the permissions to 444, meaning that we can read the file only. So now let's change the permissions to 777, for example. So we're giving all permissions to all user types. And this time we're not getting any error. Perfect. So hopefully this gave you an idea about these different constants you use with the access method, and also how to change the mode or the permissions using the change mode method of fs. Okay, so now let's move to read, write, and append, and do this the asynchronous way. So to start, let's write into our file Jupyter. So the method is write file instead of write file sync, which we used with the synchronous way. It will take the name of the file, so in our case Jupyter, and let's add something like I am learning node. So you need a callback, and let's copy this callback. Okay. So let's try this and see how it goes. And you can see that we have just written into Jupyter I am learning node, so it has overridden whatever was inside our file. Okay, perfect. So now if we have no errors, we're going to have an else statement. And inside this statement, we are going to read our file Jupyter. So fs.read file instead of read file sync. So the name is Jupyter, and we're using the UTF-8 encoding. Okay. And since we are reading inside the file, now our callback is going to have two parameters, the error and the data returned if we read successfully. So let's copy this callback and change it slightly. So instead of error, we're going to have error and data. So the second parameter is data. Error comes first. So if there are no errors, then we're going to log the content of our file, and let's say something like content of Jupyter is data. Let's have a line break there. Okay, so let's try this. And we can see the content of our file there. All right, perfect. Now, let's move to the next step, which is to append some other content to Jupyter. So inside our else statement, let's add another statement to append content to Jupyter. So to do this, we're going to use the append file method instead of append file sync. So it takes the name of the file and the content. So let's say that we're going to have a line break, and then it is so fun. And let's have a callback. Okay. And then if everything goes fine and we have no errors, we're going to read the file again. Using fs.read file, which takes the name of the file, the encoding, and we're going to have a callback again. So instead of error, we're going to have error and data. So if there are no errors, then we're going to log the data again. And I'm going to copy this statement like that. Okay, perfect. So let's try this. Okay, so that's the new content of our file. After appending a new line, it is so fun. And you can check that by clicking on the file. Perfect. Now, if you check your code, you will see that you've got a pyramid shape, which you created using the callback functions. Basically, you had to write a statement, and every time you had a callback, and then an else statement, and inside it you had another statement with a callback, and as a consequence, this created this pyramid shape. Basically, this shape is known as the callback hell. And the reason why it's called like that is because it can be the source of so many mistakes, which will lead to a lot of debugging, which will waste you too much time. So we really need to get rid of this. And you can do that by using promises or ES7's async await. And this is something we're going to be covering in the next couple of videos. Now, before we move there, let's just write a statement at the end of our code to check if our code is really asynchronous. So if you run this, let's see what you get. Well, basically at the very beginning of our code, we get this statement executed first, and then we get the remaining of our code. And the reason why is because this statement doesn't wait for callbacks to be executed, because we're doing things the asynchronous way. So while JavaScript is waiting for files to be read, written into, and so on, these statements can run as our code is asynchronous. And this is very different from what we had in the previous example, where this line of code had to wait for all this code to be executed before you can see the hello log. Okay, so in the next video, you're going to build this code again using promises.